Hi, folks. This recording is made on June 22nd, just so you know what events I might be talking about and can't as yet talk about. Some of you have sent me emails with questions. I really welcome those, so please feel free to do so with any suggestions you might have. So much is swirling around right now that I thought rather than trying to focus a fair amount of time on a single topic, I would talk a little bit about how the interrelationships of these many things that are going on play off of each other in international affairs and in US foreign policy. So I'm going to jump around quite a bit, but in the interest of linking things because I'm sure you're listening to the news, and every day there's a new set of crises and events and so forth. So let me see if I can make some linkages between those events. I guess I should start with the John Bolton and his book. I mean, John Bolton is, if I dare say so, a total creep, right? He is a nasty right-wing individual. And he is against many things that any liberal or progressive person would be in favor of. He too is against any international institutions and so forth. On the other hand, of course, his book is scoring some points. And without rehearsing them all, let me say that even if you don't read the book, and I would think that by listening to the media, you don't necessarily have to read the book or spend the money to read the book. You get enough of a gist, and the international system, so to speak, and citizens and leaders in other countries get enough of a gist that either confirms what they were already thinking or makes what they imagined might be going on even worse, and that will inform them in a relationship with the United States. I mean, people knew that he was an ignoramus on foreign affairs, but thinking that Finland is part of Russia, or telling the Prime Minister of England that he's surprised to learn that England is a nuclear power, those kinds of illustrations, I think, resonate internationally. They've been covered by all the media and the newspapers everywhere. And they make us look either not just pathetic, as everybody now agrees, we look pathetic internationally, but make us, dangerous, and make this president seem not just incompetent, but potentially dangerous, especially to other, or at least former allies and democratic administrations. The fact that he made a deal with, or seemingly made a deal with Xi of China about trade, well, that might not get that much attention in some quarters. But the fact that he said, go ahead and build those concentration camps for Uyghurs, so undermines the US role in being in favor of human rights and standing for human rights and urging other people to human rights, that actually has resonated internationally as being shocking. And that, associated with another set of events, kind of overlaps. And that is the attack against the International Criminal Court, which wants to try people, or at least examine to try people, American soldiers, American, various kinds of groups who are working in Afghanistan and those countries, who are said to have violated human rights and have committed crimes against humanity as individuals. Now, let me just say, there's the International Court of Justice. As you know, it's existed since the early 20th century, actually late 19th century, and they deal with disputes between states. The International Criminal Court is a much more recent development that is in a position to try individuals against crimes against humanity. And the reason that court came about was to address the sort of ad hoc nature of Nuremberg and the trials of the former Yugoslavia, Milosevic, and so on, to have a regular institution which can address those kinds of crimes. Now, the US is not a member of the International Criminal Court in the way that we have not ratified many treaties in the world, because even though presidents sign treaties sometimes, didn't happen in the case of the ICC, that has a complicated explanation. But in any event, the Congress then does not ratify treaties. For example, the law of the child and the law of the sea, all of those kinds of things American presidents have signed, but Congress didn't ratify. And the reason they're not ratified is because more conservative people in Congress believe that it is handing over some small piece of sovereignty to an international institution, and they consider that unconstitutional and something they don't want to do. In any event, the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court, and the International Criminal Court, however, allows states who are members to charge individuals from countries that are not members. So people in Afghanistan is a member of the International Criminal Court, can ask the International Criminal Court to address questions of violations of human rights executed by Americans in Afghanistan. Now, we in the United States and our Secretary of State has said, no way will we in any way respond to anything of this horrible, corrupt, ineffective, court. That court, the International Criminal Court, requires some criticism, as most international institutions. On the other hand, they have tried various African leaders who have most recently, they're addressing the violations of the former president of the Sudan for having committed genocide and serious crimes. Occasionally somebody is found guilty, sometimes they don't get anywhere with the case. But in any event, what this shows, and sometimes we can talk about the court in isolation, what this shows is not only American hostility to international institutions, but rather that we are essentially saying, only we, American courts, will try individuals who committed serious human rights violation. No one is in a position to criticize us and or to charge us with violations. And as it is true that the International Criminal Court allows states to be the states of where the citizens have committed crime to try their own citizens. But one of the things that has been pointed out internationally in much of the media around the world is that people who have been charged, military who've been charged, for example, with murder of Afghanistanis, have been found guilty and then pardoned by President Trump. So this does not look like a very good picture for the US, and is part of what allows us to lose our legitimacy in international affairs. Now, the other big thing that's happening in the world is, of course, the virus. And the virus has international implications, not just because it's spreading everywhere, but also the incompetence of the US in dealing with the virus has seriously eroded the confidence in the American capacity, in the CDC, and furthermore has eroded America's former contributions when there were serious health issues of various viruses, AIDS, and so forth, where the U.S. came to assist poorer countries with physicians, with medications, with major campaigns by the American government to help countries who were less capable of dealing with things. And most, of course, of that has gone away. So America's linkages into helping other countries not get destabilized by this virus and managing their economic downturn is a complete vacuum at the moment. And that has also been internationally noted. so quite aside from our concerns about the virus, and as you know, we're this more serious, out of control countries with respect to the virus. And furthermore, we are the only other country is Brazil, which has a similar cuckoo bird president who has denied problems for too long, has made wrong decisions, and as you know. Now, the virus uh, bounces around in other ways as informing international policy, and that has to do, of course, with the idea that because of interdependence, because of globalization, some of the mechanisms to confront the virus, for example, medications or parts of medications, which are produced not domestically but internationally, uh, are then show the weakness in the United States and in other countries who increasingly became interdependent in terms of medical issues. And that feeds into those people who believe that globalization has gone too far and that you need to firm up the borders between states. It's not just Brexit, but it's also the virus. Short-circuiting travel, but also having less dependence of countries on each other for the benefit of global trade, and countries now, not just the United States, looking inside themselves and saying, hey, you know, we better have national capacity to do some of these things, because if you have something like a pandemic, or if you have, you know, other countries closing their borders, or using their own supplies for domestic purposes rather than global trade purposes, we might be in difficulty. Some of that is by no means sorted out, and there are some real issues of not only having national capacity, but if you don't have national capacity, then at least having reserves to manage a medical issue or a emergency of one kind, so that you can cope for some period of time until international flows of trade can be restored. So that's a wake-up call for economic purposes, but a wake-up call that has been generated very seriously by the virus and its implications. On the other hand, there is a flip side which has an international component, which is, even though the United States and other countries are saying, let us pull back from some globalization, the information and technology aspect of globalization has, if anything, been increased, or at least the idea that there needs to be globalization for science and for technology, because while countries can disaggregate temporarily, at least, from their economic relationship or becoming more self-sufficient, the fact is that scientists are networked, laboratories are networked, and there's sharing of information. And again, the virus is exposing that. The scientists are in constant relationship with each other. The labs are, and you know this from watching the news, that you hear that a lab in England or a lab somewhere else is making progress, and there's funding coming from other countries. So there is a lot of exchange, and I would posit that it's worth just thinking about that globalization may be altered slightly in some areas of globalization, but in point of fact, some aspects of globalization, if anything, are being strengthened, or at least the idea that you need internationalization and globalization in some areas, for example, technology, for example, science, for example, research of various kinds. There even are considerable exchanges in medical personnel, which leads to a slightly different point, which is also linked, which, as you know, there has been Supreme Court action on DACA for those kids that came as small children and who want to stay in the US. You might have noticed that almost 27%, they think, of staffs in US hospitals, in doctors, nurses, support staff are in fact DACAs. So if you got rid of them, if you sent them away, which the Trump administration still wants to do, to countries which they actually have no linkages with anymore, you are losing the personnel that you need to actually sustain your own institutions. Now, this happens to be true in the United States, and it may come as a shock to many Americans how dependent we are, not just on the doctors, but on foreign born physicians trained sometimes overseas, often trained in the US, therefore immigrants who studied in the United States, and how our dependence on these people often depends on letting them in, and in the case of physicians and technical people, giving them the visas to have studied in the United States and often become American citizens. And the Trump administration is pulling all of those back. So it will be increasingly difficult for graduate students and medical students from overseas to study in the United States if Trump manages to go through with his withdrawal of the H-1 and of various initials, various kinds of visas. But the human interlinking between societies and how people have become essential workers is, quite aside from the technology issue and the science issue, a very, very major and a very global issue. That's at the high level, right, of technically competent people, either trained overseas who come here or people who want to come here to be trained here and might stay here. So that's at the top. At the lower level, you find something similar, which is, of course, that our nursing homes, our support staff in many areas, the people who work in, the various shipping industries, many of them are recent immigrants, green card holders, but many of them are also illegal. So if you are closing the border, which the Trump administration has now done, and you no longer let the flow of those people come in, and conversely, you send the existing people away, this will have a huge impact on the United States. Now, this has been noted around the world. It's been noted around the world that even in countries, let's say, like Singapore, hundreds of thousands of people are from the Philippines and from India who are the essential low-skilled workers. If Singapore decided to get rid of all of these people and send them back, Singapore as an economy would not be operational. So this is an area where globalization and interdependence has gone so far that many countries, many industrial countries, many even middle-range countries are very, very dependent on the movement of people for labor, for permanent residents. And in previous talks, I also talked about the aging out of industrial societies, which actually need immigrants. So what does this all link with? It links with, on the one hand, Trump policy. It links with, on the other hand, the decoupling to some extent of aspects of globalization. Some decoupling might be desirable and necessary, but much of it, if actually implemented, would harm the economies of the United States and other industrial countries. And in the case of the United States, and also interestingly, in the case of the United Kingdom, where also many doctors, hospital workers, and so forth come from overseas, sending folks back and pulling in and becoming nationalistic in one way or another, it would have a very serious impact. So the rhetoric about globalization has to be reduced, we can't be dependent and interdependent, one has to examine it very carefully from field to field. Now, a somewhat related issue, but not entirely related issue, is the Black Lives Matter issue. The Black Lives Matter issue looks internationally like another nail in the coffin of the United States. I mean, it isn't true that people who listen to the radio and or read the papers don't know that we are a racist society and don't know about our racist history. Uh, on the other hand, the movement of Black Lives Matter has not only caught on in the United States, but has caught on overseas. It has caught on in England, for example, in the United Kingdom, which also has Black immigrants, mostly from the Caribbean, some from more directly from Africa, who are also badly treated by the police, who also are often have economic struggles or are not managing to get out of poverty. So it's resonated in that country. And in general, most European countries now have populations of color, and so it's resonating in those countries. In some cases, in support of the United States, and in some cases, identifying their own issues. But interestingly enough, it's resonated even more widely internationally, and that is in, for example, Africa, where people are not identifying with the minority populations that are mistreated in industrial countries, but rather identifying with it in terms of their colonial past. And that is actually quite fascinating, that you are having demonstrations in various African countries which are also trying to tear down, let's say, statues of Rhodes in Zimbabwe, former Rhodesia, which are identifying the residue of colonialism in their own country. So Black Lives Matter has become internationalized in various ways in various societies. And it's worth watching that, because if it is not just a temporary phenomenon, but is a more long-term phenomenon, that too matters. Finally, without keeping you too long, I want to address another issue that has started in the US and which has huge international implications. And that is that the Trump administration is trying to destroy, actually, the reputation and the neutrality of something called global media in the United States. Global media is the umbrella term for the Voice of America and the various American broadcasts in Chinese, in Spanish, in Russian, and so forth. Now, the head, the heads resigned, the board members were fired. He is trying, the person that has been appointed is a right-wing individual associated with right-wing media, and it is a big crisis in the global media world. Now you will say, well, I haven't even heard of him. I don't really listen to the Voice of America. What difference does it make? People probably don't much listen to it anyway. And I just want to say that that's completely wrong. These international broadcasts coming from the United States, while some aspects of it may at times look a little bit like propaganda, American propaganda. In general, especially in countries that don't have free presses, for example, the former Soviet Union, Russia, East Europe, in dictatorships around the world, very often the broadcasts that come from the United States are considered to be the reliable source for information about the world, about the countries that people are living in, neighboring countries. It is not just a propaganda tool about the United States. It helps people get news. The only comparable institution is the BBC, which also has programs in Arabic and Spanish and Chinese and everything else. So the US global media networks and the BBC are for people who want to know what's going on in their own countries, which might be dictatorships or ruled by dictatorships or corrupt in one way or another, as well as wanting to know what's happening in other countries. It is the source of information where the press is not free and where access is not. This is a huge international issue, which has gotten relatively little coverage in the US media. It's important. We should inform our political leaders, Congress, and whatnot that we really care about this. I don't think there's much to be done at the moment while Trump is in power. But if Trump hopefully leaves at the end of the year, we can only hope. Uh, that has to be turned around very quickly. And in the meantime, there ought to be committee hearings in Congress on this, offering some resistance. I can't emphasize enough how important this is, not in many countries, but how important it is in terms of the US role in the world and the vestiges left of the US being a role model for democracy and freedom, and the reliance of so much of the world on the US in many ways, while it has radically declined, as I keep pointing out, because who we're now known to be quite Mad Hatters, and increasingly as being this pathetic country which is out of control and has this horrible leader. But still, there are mechanisms about the United States, for example, its international broadcasts, which give people hope and give people information, not just about the US, but about their own ability to orient themselves in their own country. And this has been an important leadership role of the United States. Yes, there are criticisms of the Voice of America and other outlets, but many, many people have relied on that. So my point this morning really has been that sometimes what seem to be domestic American issues, American domestic policies, or it seem to be particular issues like the virus, in fact, have far broader short-term, medium-term, and long-term implications. And finally, I just want to say, while the cat's away, the mice will play, because we're out to lunch on most international policies. The Chinese continue to be busy on the border of making trouble on the border between China and India, on the South China Sea, in various other parts of the world. The North Koreans are making all kinds of trouble. As you would know from the news, they burned down the building which managed their relationship with South Korea. So there are many issues in the world where those who don't wish us well or have an agenda, like the Soviet Russia and Putin, or like China, which is trying to make its mark in the world and is trying to take over some roles that the United States used to enjoy and some leverage that the United States used to enjoy, are also making trouble as much as possible to exert their power and influence. Anyway, to be continued. Thank you very much for tuning in today. I hope you all stay well and see you the next time.